reading from the Gospel of Mark, the 15th chapter, beginning with the 21st verse and continuing on through the 41st verse. It was my mistake in the bulletin, not the person who did the bulletin, so I will take the blame for that. But a certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. There they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not drink it. And they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see who would eat what each would get. It was the third hour when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified two robbers with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you are who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days. Come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him, saying among themselves, "He saved others, but he can't save himself. Let this Christ, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him. At the 6th hour, darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling Elijah." One man filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a stick, and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down," he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus heard his cry and saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Younger, and of Joseph and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. You all heard this story. If you've been to church for any length of time, you've heard this story. We tell it every year. And there's only 4 versions of it in the Bible, and they're all pretty much the same, so you're familiar with it. And that's as it should be. It's central to what it means to be a Christian. Today I want to examine a less familiar part of the story. We all have heard about why Jesus died and how his death brought about our salvation. I want to focus on one part of this story, where when Jesus died, 3 of the 4 Gospels record that the curtain in the temple is torn in two from the top to the bottom. What does that mean? Why is that detail important enough to record in the scripture? And it's a question we don't really understand the answer to unless we look at the whole Bible. Because we're going to go back to Exodus and Kings and even Ezekiel to understand what is being talked about here. And it has to do with the design of the temple. Now the temple is divided up into different places. And the first division of the temple is the outer wall. Now this is the only part of the temple that is still standing today. You can go there. It's one of the holiest sites for Judaism. It is the holiest site for Judaism in the world. And it's ironic. It's called the Wailing Wall. Now, most people think it's called the Wailing Wall because Jews go there and they wail in despair that the temple has been destroyed. But the thing is, it was called the Wailing Wall when the temple was still intact. When the Jews who now gather there would have gone into the temple. Because the Wailing Wall was as close as anyone who wasn't a Jew could get. And so they would stand outside the wall and wail and mourn that they couldn't get into the temple. They weren't Jewish. Many of them believed in God, but they didn't follow all of the practices of Judaism, hadn't converted yet, so they couldn't go in. So that's your first division. And it's beyond this point, only Jews can go. Then when you get into the temple, or got into the temple, you entered the courtyard. And in the courtyard was the sanctuary. And that was another dividing line. Any Jewish men could hang out in the courtyard. And they did. And they hung out, and they had religious discussions, and they had political discussions. It's sort of like if you go to a big church today and they got a coffee shop in there. Some of them have these now. And they hung out and talked. They probably had wine rather than coffee, but other than that, it's the same idea. But Jewish men could hang out in the courtyard, but they couldn't go into the sanctuary. Only priests were allowed in the sanctuary. What we might call the temple proper. And if you were a priest and you went into the sanctuary, you'd see this big curtain from floor to ceiling down the middle of it. And this is your third dividing line. And nobody was allowed back there. Except one day a year. The high priest, after going through extensive purification rituals and wearing specific garments, would enter past the curtain, into the Holy of Holies, into the place where God dwells on earth, into the very presence of God himself. And this was considered so dangerous that before the high priest went into the Holy of Holies, the other priests would tie a rope around his ankle. And if he was in there too long, they would tug on the rope to make sure that if he had died in there, nobody else had to risk their life going to pull his body out. And according to traditions, there were times that they had to do this. Being in the presence of God was a dangerous thing. Now, why? We don't think being in the presence of God is a dangerous thing at all. We think it's a wonderful thing. We sing about being in the presence of God. Why was it a frightening thing? Well, the closest parallel I can think of are the protocols for people dealing with nuclear power. Because the security systems built around nuclear power plants are not built to keep the nuclear energy safe. They're built to keep the people who work around nuclear energy safe. There's a story that when Hiram Rickover was designing the Nautilus, and he had all these safety procedures in place for the reactor, for the first nuclear-powered submarine. And the board was looking at, the Navy board was looking at the cost for all of these safety protocols. And they said, well, these are redundant. We don't need all of these safety protocols. It should be good enough. Now, the admiral had done his homework. And he pointed to 4 members of the board and he said, your sons are all in the Navy. And I've already assigned all of them to be on this ship. And the board approved every single safety precaution that he wanted put in place. You know, oh, if it's our son, we want top of the line. No cost is too much. Again, it's not to protect the power. It's to protect everybody else. The Bible in the Old Testament tells us no one can see God and live. Moses asked to see God, and God says, you can't. I tell you what, I'll let you see me as I'm walking away from you. And even then, it's only going to be a brief glimpse and not a very clear one. And we're told that in the book of Exodus, when Moses went in to talk with God, when he came out, he glowed. Yeah, sounds like nuclear power to me. But that's not the issue. The issue is why these precautions were set up. It wasn't to protect what was inside, it was to protect what was outside. Now, what happens when the curtain is torn in two? Your fence is down. Your protection is gone. It's like in Jurassic Park when the fences go down and all the dinosaurs get out. No one is safe. Except this is worse, because the curtain is torn and the presence of God is no longer confined to the temple. Now, if God's presence is no longer confined to the temple, and humans cannot live in the presence of God, what should have happened? Everyone should have died. And that didn't happen. That's not recorded in the Bible anywhere, and it wouldn't be, because if everybody had died, there'd be nobody to record it. So there's only 2 options then. If humans cannot live in the presence of God, and the presence of God is no longer confined to the temple, either God changed or humans changed. Either God is no longer as powerful as he was, and his presence doesn't affect us, or humans have been changed so that we can dwell in the presence of God. So that we can live in a world where God is not confined, but where God's presence is everywhere. We often talk about Jesus' sacrifice as having benefit for people who believe. Because when we believe, we attain salvation. We're given that through God's grace. But it did much more than that. Christ's sacrifice was effective for everyone. Those who believe and those who don't believe. Because we all live in God's presence. It surrounds us every second of our lives. Yet, we do it without fear of his presence. It's the most amazing thing. We can approach God without going, oh, I can't approach him, I'm a terrible sinner. In fact, when we're a terrible sinner, that's the best time to approach God. We were changed. All of creation was changed by Christ's death on the cross. God did not become less powerful, but we were remade, to be as it was in the beginning. Remember, I said you have to understand the whole Bible to get this part. So we're going back to Genesis. We're going back to the garden. And we're told that Adam and Eve walked each day with God in the garden. And we're not ashamed. That's the gift that Christ gave to everyone, on top of the gift of our salvation that we have to choose to accept. This is a gift that we were given whether we asked for it or not. A gift we were given whether we knew that we needed it or not. The ability to live in the presence of God without fear. And next to your salvation, that's the greatest gift you've ever been given. Any of you want to go try to walk into the governor's mansion and talk to the governor, you can call me when they arrest you and you get one phone call. Same if you want to go see the president. But if you want to talk to God, if you want to live in God's presence, you can do so without fear. And that is one of the greatest gifts you've ever been given. Our closing hymn is Lead Me to Calvary, number 310.